Okay, we should be live now. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially to our panelists that have joined us from all over the GTA and all over the province. Actually, we have some people that are joining us from Ottawa too. So those of you that are joining in from Zoom, and those of you that are tuning in from Facebook Live, thank you as well for joining us today. My name is Samia Hassan, and I'm the executive director here at CASA. Before we begin the program, I would just like to acknowledge that the work of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians takes place on traditional indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work, meet, and play on this territory as settlers. So before I introduce our program and our amazing speakers for today, I'd like to turn the virtual mic over to Sangha Ajagzai, who is the chair of the board here at CASA, to start us off. Sangha?
Thank you, Samia. Thank you, Samia. Respected audience and CASA's dear friends and supporters, I welcome you all to this very special evening where we have found an opportunity to highlight the work of our Canadian South Asian Trailblazers who have served well and continue to support environmental justice. Given the sensitivity and importance of climate change and considering the underrepresentation of South Asian environmental leaders in our Canadian society, made us bring these two themes together in the form of our South Asian Heritage Month poster of 2020. This is indeed our attempt to let our South Asian community recognize the environmental ambassadors who are among us. Unfortunately, for the past few decades, the way that we have interacted with our planet has put us in bad terms with Earth. Our behaviors have continuously compromised the safety of our environment. This takes me back. I still remember taking one of the elective courses many moons ago when I was in university. It was called environmental biology, and it was then when I realized how rapid and hurtling our intake of resources was. Simply put, there is an imbalance between the human demands and supply of natural resources. And needless to say, we are short on the supply. What frightened me then and still continues to haunt me today is that if we do not improve our relationship with the environment sooner rather than later, our future generations will be short of clean air to breathe, safe water to drink, and of course, many other resources that are essential for one to live. We can all make contributions to a healthier environment in small ways, as I'm a strong believer of the saying that goes, individually we may be a drop, but together we can make an ocean. And this can be true when speaking of our individual efforts that together could make a significant impact on the betterment of our climate. And respected folks, this brings me to the end of my talk. Again, I am thrilled to be among our environmental champions who have and continue to work, fight, and advocate for a healthier climate for all and environmental justice. And now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it back to our very talented executive director, Samia Hassan, who will walk you through the rest of the agenda for tonight. Hope you enjoy. Once again, thank you for joining us. Stay safe, healthy, and keep social distancing. Thank you. Samia, back to you, please.
Thank you, Sangha. Um, so, uh, so really great points, and your point about being in high school and that education that brings you back to what we're talking about today. And I hope a lot of the youth that are going to be watching this it'll also resonate with them. And some of the points that we bring up today are things that they will remember for a long time as well. So today's panel discussion is part of CASA South Asian Heritage Month festivities. So this is how here at CASA we celebrate South Asian Heritage Month, and sometimes to the disappointment of certain folks that are just looking for entertainment of the South Asian culture, and they're looking for samosas and some music. But I mean, that's important too. But I think having these discussions is a critical aspect of celebrating heritage of any community. So this year, we obviously, because of the situation that we're currently in with the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to do things a little bit differently. We took a little bit of a different route than our usual poster campaign and our reception. And with many of you, which may be the case, we had to pivot and adapt this particular program and project to the new reality of working while in a global pandemic situation. We adapted our poster to a larger audience that was more on social media as opposed to doing a large printout of the poster and distributing that a physical poster to school boards and libraries and police stations and not-for-profit organizations. We shifted that to be mostly online. And just a quick shout out to Rahul and his team from Five and Vine, who supported us with this task and took on the design of the poster for this year. So thank you, Rahul, for doing that. And so we continued, we try to continue with the partnerships that we've built for the South Asian Heritage Month um, celebrations that we have done over the past couple of years, which includes the school boards and the police services, not-for-profit organizations, our member agencies. We involved them on our social media, the campaign that we did to share our poster, to bring more attention and more awareness around the issue that we chose for this year, which Sangha alluded to as environmental justice. And we did receive a lot of attention from all sorts of different audiences. So whether it was, community members, youth, people that are actively involved in the environmental justice field, we received a lot of attention for this particular theme. And then just a little bit of background on why we chose this particular theme this year. Obviously, it's increasingly becoming an issue of concern, an issue of importance, something that is on the radar of many individuals and communities and decision makers. So we were looking at ways to increase the connection of the South Asian community, specifically in the GTA, to environmental justice and particularly Indigenous environmental justice. And last year, CASA, with some federal funding, did a small project, and we did a workshop series with seniors and youth on Indigenous environmental justice. And through that project, we found that there is a lot of interest in the communities, in the South Asian communities, for environmental justice. There is a lot of passion for it, and there is this desire to learn more. Like, I can't tell you enough how much the seniors especially enjoyed learning about Indigenous environmental justice, and they had specifically asked us that they would like to learn more, and for us to keep coming back and teaching them and getting them involved in some of the initiatives and projects. So we're hoping that once the COVID-19 um, settles down a little bit, we can get back into some of that work and working with seniors again and working with youth again on this area of environmental justice. So for this reason, the board at CASA decided to focus on this particular theme and highlight it as part of our South Asian Heritage Month celebrations. So again, we have several amazing, 7 to be exact, amazing South Asian Canadian trailblazers who are paving the way for other South Asian Canadians, including our youth, to get involved in the environmental justice movement and in the advocacy. So obviously, they want to see a planet, a safe and healthy planet, so that they can live on it and their future generations can live on it. Um, So I'll introduce our Trailblazers one by one, and just a little bit of housekeeping and how the program is going to work. We have a structured panel discussion where I will ask the panelists a few questions. All of the panelists will have an opportunity to answer those questions. And then at the end, we have allocated about half an hour for the audience to ask questions. So whether you are logged in from Zoom or whether you're on Facebook Live, you can always type in your questions in the chat box. On Zoom, if you can either private message them to Yamna, who's the Zoom host here. Yamna, if you want to wave your hand, or you can send them to everybody and we'll take a look at those questions and note them down. And then same thing for Facebook Live. If you just want to type them in into the comment section, we'll have somebody look at those comments and questions, and we'll try as best as we can to get those questions answered. So I'll start with Vishal. So Vishal, usually we do this with alphabetical order, but I thought let's just flip it and do it the other way around and give Vishal the first go. So Vishal Vijay is a children's rights activist, student, and co-founder and CEO of Every Child Now, a youth-run national nonprofit he founded in 2012, and that empowers kids to help other kids and provides them with their basic needs, such as clean water, food, shelter, education, and healthcare. At 19 years old, Vishal is leading a movement to engage young people in activism and inspiring them to join him in creating a culture of caring. Through collaborations with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, WE Charity, and other humanitarian leaders, he's impacted more than 500,000 people and raised more than $100,000 and helped to uplift thousands of families out of poverty. Rahul Raj is the founder of Five and Vine, an agency that helps socially and environmentally minded startups grow. His commitment to bettering the world includes chapters as Ecobee's CMO, where he transformed the organization into the #2 smart thermostat brand, the sustainability lead at Walmart.com, where he built a refurbishing infrastructure that diverted millions of electronics from landfills and generated billions in new sales, and the founder of Meal Exchange, where he facilitated the donation of $5 million to feed those in need. He has been honored with a fellowship from the Aspen Institute, by Good Magazine as Pushing the World Forward, and by Time Magazine as Revolutionary. Simran Donna is an organizer with Climate Justice Toronto and Climate Justice Peel, youth-led groups addressing the climate crisis by confronting its root causes: capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy. Simran started her political work through labor organizing in the Fight for 15 and Fairness campaign. She has also written for Briarpatch Magazine and Toronto Star on topics related to labor and justice and climate justice. Simran is currently completing her Master's of Public Health and Epidemiology at the University of Toronto and hopes to build to help multiracial working class power in the suburbs. Panenda Tind, unwavering desire to create sustainable, equitable, and resilient communities has always guided her work. As a sustainability consultant, she helps organizations manage climate risks and transitions a green economy. Kunenda holds a Bachelor of Environmental and Business degree from the University of Waterloo. Her passion for climate justice extends into her commitments to volunteerism. She is active in her local community as a global shaper of the Toronto Hub and as an organizer with Climate Justice Peel. Linda has been recognized as one of Canada's top 30 under 30 sustainability leaders and as a Clean 50 honoree for her contribution towards climate action. I have three more, but I just wanted to take a pause and say, like, I've read these bios maybe 100 times as we were working on the posters, but every time I read them, I'm still astonished as to the amount of accomplishments and the advocacy and the involvement of these brilliant leaders, these South Asian trailblazers that we have today. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. But bear with me as I have three more to go. Gauri Srinivasan is the Policy and Campaigns Director at Nature Canada, where she leads advocacy work to engage Canadians and decision makers in the actions needed to address the crisis of species lost and protect nature for all. From the Canadian Council or the International Development To Parliament Hill, to the research community, Gauri has been working for over 25 years to build alliances across sectors to advance issues of equity, human rights, corporate accountability, and sustainable development. She is passionate about building Canadian leadership at a local level, national and global, to secure a healthy and sound future for all of life on the planet. Maya Menezes is a climate and migrant justice organizer based in Toronto. She is a senior manager of programming and development at a climate justice organization, The Leap, where she campaigns for a Green New Deal. Maya is the co-host of The Leap's podcast, Change Everything, which unpacks intersections of climate, racial, and economic justice. She's been developing and leading campaigns changing borders, capitalism, racism, and climate for years. She is an organizer with No One is Illegal Toronto, Climate Justice Toronto, Power Shift Young and Rising, and Climate Justice Delegate to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in 2016, 2018, and the 2020 conference, whenever that does happen. Dusha Sridharan has immersed in grassroots environmental justice work in Toronto over the last decade. She has been involved in local efforts for climate justice, improving public transit, and supporting good jobs. Dusha currently works for the City of Toronto as a policy advisor with a focus on environmental issues. She previously worked as a climate change campaigner for the Toronto Environmental Alliance and also served as a steering committee member for the Toronto Climate Action Network. Dusha continues to take on an intersectional approach in connecting her work on environmental issues to broader movements around social justice and equity. All right. So I promise for the rest of the session, I'm not going to talk as much, and I'm going to let our speakers do all the talking. So let's start off on a positive note, and any of you can start with this. Can you describe, I know I did your bios, but if you can describe some of the things that you consider as your successes, your greatest successes so far in your advocacy work, in your leadership work, in relation to the environmental justice work that you've done. What would you consider them to be the greatest successes so far? Should I pick on somebody to start? Okay, Rahul, since you nodded, I'll get you to go first.
Damn it. So everything that I'm about to say is just to qualify it. It's part of it's my involvement, but as we all know, very few people do anything individually. So just know that is the qualifier. A couple of the things that I'm most proud of is one, building out a refurbishing infrastructure for Walmart. So I think as we all know, Walmart is a massive company and they sell a bunch of stuff, and all of that stuff is new and it finds its way into landfills. And what I tried to do there was demonstrate how there was money to be made from stuff that already exists. And so I built up a refurbishing infrastructure that enabled people to bring back their used electronics. We gave them market value in the form of cash. I built up an infrastructure that we could refurbish it to like new condition, and then we resold it as a refurbished item. And what I was trying to do there was advance a thesis that we don't need new things. We can build things to last and to be upgraded. In the process, we generated $2.2 billion in net new revenue for Walmart, diverted millions of pounds of electronics from landfill. But it was really, aside from the monetary impact and the environmental impact, which was significant, it was more of the insight for a, particularly, profit-minded organization that there's another way to make money, that there could be a better way to make money, and essentially combating the fallacy of ownership. All of us, we don't really own anything. We lease everything in life. We can't take it with us when we're gone. So we use it for a period of time and we either pass it on to someone else or it finds its way back into the earth, either in a healthy way or in a destructive way. But if we can think about the maximizing the number of people that get to touch it and use it, that item, then we can prolong the life of items and minimize the need to manufacture new goods. So that's one example.
Thank you. Maya, do you want to go next?
Sure. Also, my internet's not that great, so if I cut out, just let me know.
No.
And your question, Samia, is what's something we've done we're excited about?
So what do you consider as your greatest success so far in your advocacy work?
I don't know what has been the most successful, but I can tell you the thing I'm most excited about right now. And that is at the LEAP, we're launching a project called the People's Bailout, which went live a couple weeks ago, which largely is to combat this narrative that there can be ethical consumption under capitalism, which I think fundamentally I reject as someone who believes in environmental justice. I think that what an exciting thing that we saw about how people rallied once the bailout information was released, which largely was about just bailing out major oil companies and corporations, fossil fuel industry, and actually no tangible material supports for people on the ground. We've seen like sick days slashed for frontline workers. We've seen that like our healthcare system was gutted viciously and ferociously and intentionally for years and years and years. And the reason that we're in the middle of a pandemic, the likes of which we've never seen before, is not because we couldn't have been prepared for it. It's because all of our social institutions were systematically gutted for decades and decades and decades, and that was sold to us as something that would help us, when really it was just about making wealthy people richer. And so there's this whole frame that you see emerging now as people come to terms with that, which is Corona is the virus, but capitalism is the pandemic. And the People's Bailout is really about reframing where we need to invest in supports for people to make material impacts in people's lives and to challenge the global system that we're in that prioritizes profit over people always. And so you can check out the peoplesbailout.ca. It's a very exciting project that I'm very, very proud of, that I've done with my comrades and colleagues at the LEAP. And we're going to be talking about the ways that if we believe in environmentalism and we believe in environmental justice, then fundamentally what that means is that we reject capitalism. It means that we put power into the hands of people and workers. It means that we weaken the chokehold of billionaires in our communities, in our countries, in nation states, and that we also fundamentally reject the concept of borders. And so that's a project that I'm really excited about that's moving now, that people can look up and plug into.
Thank you so much, Maya. Would it be possible for you just to send us a link of that project in the chat box? Not right now, but whenever you have a chance to do that. Great. Dusha, do you want to go next?
Sure, I can go next. Everyone can hear me okay? Great. So I think one of the things I found very, very interesting in my work in environmental justice is how we define success, especially when you're thinking about combining advocacy and environmental justice. We're often thinking of success as meaning you want something, whether it's a policy change or something that you've been working for, but those things take a lot of time. So I think I had to go through a process of redefining success and what it meant to me in this work. And one of the big things I noticed was how I would find these smaller markers in between. So to give you an example, when I worked at the Toronto Environmental Alliance, they were in the process at the City of Toronto of developing the new climate change plan, Transform TO. And we were pushing, let's get it fully funded, let's get all these different things and have action on it. But we realized all along the way, there were other things that weren't happening. There wasn't enough diversity in terms of the engagement of who was getting involved and having a say in the process. So we started changing it. We took it upon ourselves to actually broaden the consultation, think about how we can make it more engaging for folks, and think about how, as an organization with, while I was at the Toronto Environmental Alliance, how we would take on the responsibility of trying to engage diverse communities through our work. So for me, the policy changes are a big piece, and now I work in a counselor's office, so I see the importance of that. But there's also things along the way about making sure we're thinking about applying different perspectives, an equity lens to our work, to make sure that we're thinking about the other types of successes and bringing, the role we play, especially as South Asian people in a movement that's generally quite white. How can we be an ally? How can we bring up issues? And it's not just representing, necessarily the communities we come from, but also just thinking about diversity as a whole. So I think there's a lot in my work that I've been able to sort of chip away, but in some ways those little things have been my greatest wins, I think, and I've seen the impacts of it when we're seeing changes around the table about who's being involved in conversations. And I think that's why I was really excited for this panel to come together as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight, Dusha. Puninda?
Sure. I think, Dusha, what you said really resonates with me in terms of, redefining success and what does success mean when you're doing this work around climate justice and environmental justice. And the idea of climate justice, I think, can seem a little bit abstract, especially how we talk about it within our own communities. I know when I went to university to study environment and business, it was very difficult to explain to my parents and family, like, what am I going to do with this degree and what does this really mean? And I think once we bring down, climate justice to a level of, what it means could be fighting for, green affordable housing, valuing low carbon jobs like care work, and advocating for free public transit. I think that really resonates with folks because you're speaking to issues and struggles that many working class people, especially in our communities, are directly facing on a daily basis. And to your point, Maya, I'm really excited about People's Bailout and all the work that you guys have been doing at LEAP, which is really pushing the narrative and the movement forward on that front. I guess more from a personal perspective, in terms of successes, I've been very grateful and lucky to have had a host of mentors that have kind of guided my career so far. Previously I did some work with Sustainable Waterloo Region when I was at Waterloo. It's an organization that focuses on getting other institutions, the cities or other businesses in the local community to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And so really seeing and being an active part of that community to grow that network and discussing with businesses on how we can transition to a green economy in a sustainable way has been really exciting part of my journey so far.
Great. Thank you so much, Puninda. Gauri, and then we'll have Simran and Vishal.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, I'm just super inspired already hearing the panelists before me. So thanks again for the opportunity to join everyone this evening. I think it's always a good challenge to ask environmental activists where have they seen success? As Maya said, what are you excited about? Because in many ways, it's hard to see success when you think about success as external breakthroughs. We have major crises around us, from the health crisis that you spoke about in your introduction, the climate crisis with an ever-warming Earth, but also the crisis of nature and the destruction of species all around us. We have about 1 million species headed to extinction around the world, which is not separate from us. We are part of the Earth, and provides the biodiversity we need, as you said, for food, for clean air, for water. So when we think about where have we been successful, we have to drill down and think hard about what is it that has been working. And I agree with many of the others who have focused on the opportunity and the growth in movements and people power. I think there has been a growing recognition of the intersection of issues, even just the COVID pandemic, which we've seen, has helped, I think, Canadians from a lot of walks of life see and value what is essential and what is valued differently. We've noted the crisis in the healthcare system. We've seen how elders haven't been valued. We've seen that people actually are standing up to fight for community gardens and for local green space and for dignity for frontline workers. But at the same time, I think we've also seen how nature is essential to us and has an incredible value, whether that's just trying to fight for access to nearby green space, to the forests, oceans, and wetlands that are so critical for air, water, or pollination. And so I think it's not a success yet, but it's a sort of a hoped for success as we see a new kind of pushback about what is valuable and what has the system valued and not valued, and the need for us to be a lot clearer with decision makers and those in power that we want to see supports for what is essential, which includes not only the critical social infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt, but the need to support nature and its systems and the way that it holds us, both for our short-term health and well-being, but long-term, of course, for our survival. So I don't personally claim great breakthroughs in building this. I think it's something that's been built through a variety of sectors. But what I have experienced and why I can find hope is that my own personal journey, and I think I'm probably a little older than others on the panel, I've had the opportunity to work through with activists from a lot of different sectors. And so I feel that a success has been, or a benefit that I have had, is learning from the analysis that comes from thinking about equality and human rights, from background in human rights, from learning from frontline activists in South Asia, in Latin America, and Africa about the North-South dimension of a lot of the inequalities and environmental injustice we face. And so I've had success in being able to navigate and bridge some amazing learnings and wisdom from sectors, from these different angles. And then I bring that to my environmental activism now and try and help both my organization and those we work with approach environmental justice from a perspective of justice, of equality with nature, and also the racialized and unequal dimensions of those who have access to nature and to healthy environments. And so it's not, I wouldn't call it success yet, but I feel success in having learned those kind of different perspectives. And I feel some hope and optimism about the intersectional movements for change that are building around us, and that we see here on the panel today.
Thanks, Corey. I feel like you'll enjoy my second question on challenges more. But we'll let who do we have? We have Simran and Vishal answer the question on successes first before we move on to challenges.
Thanks, Samia. I was actually going to go straight into the challenges, so I'm glad you clarified. I always like to start on that note. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm an organizer with Climate Justice Peel, as Samia mentioned, as well as doing some mutual aid work in Peel as well. And in terms of strengths and successes, I want to talk a little bit about where we were before the pandemic. So many of you may be aware that before Canada was shut down or on a lockdown, Canada was being shut down by Indigenous land defenders, by settler allies across the country in a very real and unprecedented way through direct action. And we were successfully able to address and really attack those chokehold points of the Canadian economy in a way that gave working people, gave Indigenous communities power over the Canadian colonial settler state. And I think it's really important to mention and not erase that, because what we're seeing now is the complete erasure of what was happening and what is happening right now during the pandemic, right? Naomi Klein talks a lot about disaster capitalism, everything that capitalists and states get away with during a crisis while everyone is struggling to survive. But right now, we're actually seeing that, you know, the pipeline on Wet'suwet'en land by CGL, or even the Trans-Canada pipeline, and so many other extractive projects are considered essential by the Canadian state. And so I want to bring attention to that, because that was a serious and unprecedented success that paved the way and shows the way for every other movement, whether it's the labor movement or, you know, the abolitionist movement, migrant justice movement, that it is possible to shut things down in a way where we're all united. And specifically for Climate Justice Peel, I really hold that experience and that that direct action led by Indigenous land defenders close to my heart, because in Peel, that was the first time a lot of my comrades, a lot of folks in Climate Justice Peel, young people, engaged in railway blockades and highway blockades. And let me just tell you, that is one of the most radicalizing and important things you can do to challenge capitalism and colonialism. And so that is what we do with Climate Justice Peel. We challenge those things. We don't just say that we do those things, we do it. And I remember one of our members saying, while we were sitting in a cafe afterwards to debrief, that, you know, she finally understood, as a young person from the suburbs where we think we're all depoliticized, she said that she finally understood what it means to, you know, sacrifice and like think about what you would put on the line, how you would put your body on the line for other people's liberation, for Indigenous people's liberation. What does it mean to protect the rights of Indigenous folks whose land is being stolen? And what we saw just last week is something just completely abhorrent and disgusting, which is that Alberta's energy minister literally said that, you know, it's so good that the pandemic has physical distancing where more than 15 people can't protest, because now we can go ahead with these pipelines with the oil sands projects. So what we're seeing right now is the continuation of colonial genocide and land theft. And I think what happened before the pandemic really goes to show that we're going to be right back on those rails after the pandemic. We are, as a movement, an environmental justice, a climate justice movement in solidarity with Indigenous folks, are also looking at creative ways right now during the pandemic to continue putting on pressure through phone banks, through digital organizing. And so I think this is a success that has pulled in people, specifically South Asian, as well as Black folks from the suburbs, from Peel, into this space. Where we're really showing up for each other. And so I really consider that a strength. I'm gonna leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks. Simran, when you get a chance, can you either send a Facebook link or a website link for Climate Justice Peel for us on the chat? Thank you. And Vishal?
And perfect, that's me. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be among all of these distinguished individuals on the panel, very humbled as well. So thank you all for all of the work that you're doing in trying to protect Canada's future. I think, Gori, you said it great when you said that climate activism and environmental justice touches so many other parts of activism. And I think that one of those is children's rights. For a bit of background, my name is Vishal, as mentioned, and I run an organization called Every Child Now. And what we're really trying to do is help to uplift children out of the cycle of poverty and also empower kids to help other kids. And what we're really seeing is that when we have a lot of climate issues and a lot of environmental issues, ultimately those issues do affect children. Oftentimes some of our most vulnerable populations, some of our most vulnerable people, particularly with the pandemic, how it's been affecting children and their education. That's been something that has been completely unprecedented. And that kind of was part of what caused Every Child Now to pivot. Recently, we launched a new initiative, and this is kind of a little bit of the success that you were talking about, but something that we've been really excited about it's called socialeducating.com. And essentially what it is it's a free one-to-one online homework help and tutoring resource that connects university students and high school students with kids all across Canada in grades 4 to 8. And we're also connecting students in Bermuda. One thing that we're seeing is with COVID-19, with coronavirus, a lot of children aren't able to attend school. And when they're not attending school, they're really missing out on a lot of those foundational building blocks for their education. A lot of teachers are completely strapped and don't have the resources that they need to help. And a lot of parents aren't also in a position to always be able to help. Many of them are frontline workers and many of them are busy with their jobs, or many of them are also worrying about the stresses of their new financial reality. So we started this initiative to try and bridge the gap in digital online learning and to give kids a fighting chance for their future.
And when I look at social educating, as well as a lot of the initiatives that Every Child now runs, whether it is building wells or whether it is building schoolhouses or trying to get out and encourage young people to get involved in activism, whether it's children's rights activism or environmental activism or a whole sorts, what I really see is that environmental activism kind of is that thread that connects a lot of issues, because ultimately what it is it's fighting for a more sustainable future. It's fighting for a better country. And I think that if our public health system and infrastructure was stronger pre-corona, we wouldn't be having the issue where many children aren't in school, where many families are worrying about their next meal, and where we're seeing unemployment rates of roughly 25%, right? The effects that has for particularly low-income families, they're oftentimes the ones that are being hit the hardest. So I think that by trying to respond to this climate crisis in a meaningful and impactful way, particularly with the work that a lot of organizations here today are doing, that's one of the best ways that we can protect children's futures.
Great, thank you, Vishal. And same thing, if you can send us the link for your social education project, that would be great. So let's talk about some of the challenges. And I know some of you have already alluded to some of the challenges, but if you can talk about the challenges in the context of being a South Asian Canadian leader in this field. So we know Dusha mentioned that there's not a lot of South Asian Canadians that are being recognized for being in this field. So what are some of the challenges that you face when you're kind of surrounded by people that are not necessarily of the same kind of background as you? Is there, racism within the field? I know, Maya, in the previous talk that you did at our AGM last year, and you mentioned something that I will never forget, that if there was a spaceship and they were the climate justice advocates were to take us off this planet, they would leave all the brown and black people behind. So keeping that in mind and in that context, what do you think are some of the challenges? So I will just have maybe Dusha go first.
Sure, I can go first. This is something I grapple with all the time. I think, especially starting out as a young person in the movement, I found it really challenging because there were a lot of times where I would be in a table or a space where they're talking about environmental justice, and there's a sense of sometimes people will talk about, especially when you think about climate change, nature in a way that it does not include people. And I always found that very, very difficult because, you're hearing about so many different crises on an ongoing basis. And there was a clear disconnect for people in terms of what they were seeing as environmental issues versus people's issues. And I think part of my work on an ongoing basis at different tables and conferences, even within organizations I've worked with, is challenging some of those narratives. So to give you an example, we'll talk about something as simple as recycling. And I've heard even, people who are employed higher positions say, well, it's really challenging to get people in racialized communities to understand, how to recycle. So that's part of why we're having challenges in high-rise buildings, for example. And so something so concrete, and you think about it and you're like, well, that can't be true, because if my family or a lot of other families that are racialized, they come from backgrounds in countries where they're actually sorting their waste, they're reusing things as much as possible. So this is something so small, but it would come up over and over again. And those conversations become more and more challenging when you're the only racialized person at that table. Or to flip it, sometimes at a table you're asked, well, what do you think? As someone who's racialized, as someone who's from Scarborough, what do you think all of the people who are Tamil from Scarborough think on this issue? And it becomes very challenging to try and represent so many different interests in that way. So I think part of our challenge is actually really working to diversify the space so that it's not up to a few people to keep having those conversations, but also to build more allyship. And it's not just within ourselves. Like, I've had the privilege of actually working with Maya, so we've had these conversations many times before. But it's really important. It's important that you have a space to debrief with other people who are going through these things. And as more young people come into that space, that they have mentors, that they have people they can speak to about it, because it's not easy, but hopefully it gets easier.
Great. Maya, do you want to go next?
Sure, definitely. I love that you remember the spaceship thing. To clarify, it was in response to someone who said we should support the liberals, to which I said if there was a spaceship, they would get on it and leave us behind. But yeah, about difficulties. I mean, difficulties are so complicated. It's so, I won't, but I think that there's always going to be that tokenizing factor, but I'm feeling a lot and thinking a lot more, and I'm going to like go against your question and answer the question I want to be asked instead, which is in what responsibilities do we have in the kind of brownness that we inhabit? Because of course there's tokenization, of course we're going to experience racism, but something that I am becoming more and more grounded in is I'm much more against diversity and much more pro-politicization. And that's because in a lot of ways, I think as in the spectrum of people of color, South Asians are seen as non-threatening. And so we are lifted up into positions of authority and power very quickly and depoliticized as a political strategy, to be quieter, to get on side with supremacist values, capitalistic values, harmful values, anti-Black values, anti-Indigenous values. And in that way, we can become very dangerous. And so I try and think a lot about what it means to be a settler and be complicit in the imperialist project, in the neoliberal project, and what it means to be an effective person in movement in a way that can actually affect policy and affect movement work and support people that do work on the ground. I was smiling a lot when Simran was talking about the blockades, because that is a massive thing that happened for a huge period of time. The chokeholds and arterial chokeholds of the movement to capital in this country were effectively shut down. And collective memory is so short, and we forget those things are possible. But it was very important and so critical in those moments to see South Asian solidarity out on the front lines, out on the rail paths. And one of the most fun things about getting to work with Simran, for example, besides the fact that we have this joke that you have to have this hair to be the MC for those rallies, was seeing all these South Asians and seeing all of these like other racialized folks out there for Indigenous solidarity. And that's such an important responsibility that we have, to connect these struggles, to talk about the ways that, you know, we have all these, like in Canada, we have this very simplified version of what oppression is. And sometimes we can download it so much to just race, but of course it's so much deeper than that. I know a lot of fellow Desis who grew up in my part of Scarborough who are incredibly class privileged. And the identity politics surrounding race often erases that. And it's really important to recognize that we are complicit and involved in a lot of really complex systems of oppression. So while we experience racism, absolutely, and classism, absolutely, I'm always trying to think about all of the intersections of identity that play into what makes this harder and easier. Because I think in a lot of ways, on a personal note, and I think I talked about this in the AGM, I continually get lifted up into positions where people think like, oh, what do other brown people think? And that's super dangerous. And it's also a huge responsibility. So it's really important to remember and to stay grounded in communities that we're accountable to, and to people that exist at different intersections of oppression than we do. And to remember that we are part of a much bigger movement for liberation, in which if someone is left behind, all of us are left behind. And so that's something that I find very difficult to grapple with, because I don't think it's also something that we're given a lot of space to really unpack. And try to do that as much. I'm trying to do that more.
Great. Thanks so much, Maya. Simran?
Sorry, my mute button wasn't working. I'm gonna maybe try to keep it short because I think Maya covered a lot of my sentiments around that and my political leanings. Or maybe what I can do to make it more maybe concrete and build on that is to talk about Peel. I think some of the challenges of organizing for climate justice and all other forms of justices in Peel is also, especially in the South Asian community, a lot of the internalized racism and homophobia and classism and casteism that never gets named. And a lot of people, especially young people, you know, as I've only been organizing in Peel with Paninda in the last year with Climate Justice Peel, and we're not an NGO. But I see, when I think about like, what is the movement ecosystem in Peel compared to like Toronto? And for the most part, 99.9% of groups are nonprofits. And I think, you know, I think we have to ensure that we're building a movement culture that doesn't rely on, you know, funders that dilute our politics, and that even with NGOs, we build alliances, we do this work, and we redistribute resources. We redistribute resources to movements that do name casteism, that do name classism and homophobia and racism. I'm also thinking a lot about some of the challenges of Peel, especially in how we're pitted against each other. And I know, you know, in the Punjabi community, you know, there's such a demonization of people who are international students. You know, my parents watch the evening Punjabi news like all the time, and I see these like uncles call in and be like, well, these international students are getting curbed, but our domestic students are only getting the student discount, or this discount, the student benefit. And so we have to actively do the work in our communities of naming that this is divisive capitalist politics, and we have more in common with international students who are working in warehouses at Subway than we do with some of the real estate developers that are also brown uncles, and we have to call those people in. And so I think we really need to have a conversation about some of the internalization of oppression that we've done in our community, some of the respectability politics where, you know, people who've made it, people who think that change comes from NGOs, and really like challenging that and saying, you have license to say that, you know, this inequality, this differential power dynamic exists, and we can actually work together to dismantle that, and we can have each other's backs. Because I think it's important to note that, you know, second generation, especially young people, think that the best way to succeed is through professionalization. And I think it's important to note that like we can do this work outside of those systems. We can do it in addition to those systems, but know that that work comes from relationship building with our elders intergenerationally, and really being honest about where those fault lines and where those tensions are in our community.
Thank you, Simran, for that really honest answer. And we've done some work in Peel, and you were part of that as well with Jesse, and so I can resonate to some of that, and we did hear a lot of that from the community as well. So, but together, hopefully, we can make some change, and we can change some perspectives. Gauri.
Sorry, everyone has the mini pause while they unmute. I think, yeah, so many of those that have gone before me have really kind of nailed it. What is the challenge of being of South Asian descent, of being racialized, and what is often the privilege and the power that others don't feel, and how you navigate that in between space. I am about a year, just over a year and 15 months now at Nature Canada, which is a certain part of the environmental ecosystem, in the sense that it's more conservation organizations. And I don't think it will surprise anyone on this panel, and we've certainly talked about it in my organization, that the conservation world is an incredibly white world, and it is one that is rife with colonial baggage around what we have to preserve spaces for you know, people to go enjoy hiking or you know, enjoying seeing birds. And when you what it's been so important to do is to unpack both the colonial history of the dispossession of of First Peoples from lands to create parks and conservation areas, but also really interrogating this question of who are naturalists, who are conservationists. And it has often been traditionally just people with time, leisure time and income that's enabled them to go out, as opposed to holding down 4 jobs. And so the challenge of working now at the sort of the nexus of what is the future for protecting life ecosystems and life systems in Canada is, on the one hand, to come to terms fundamentally with the need to support Indigenous-led visions for conservation, which have been in practice for millennia, and the obligation of the conservation sector to both unpack their own colonial roots and to create space and argue for new kind of governance models and resource distribution that allows much more Indigenous self-governance of territories. And then the role of how we can engage Canadians from all different racialized backgrounds in that also requires important work. And the challenge has been in the framing of it, not to assume who has time and access for green space. I love the story of the recycling. That it's classic. It's like people probably don't know how to recycle. It's like, have you ever been? There is no better recycling than some of the stuff that I saw anyway in India. But it's understanding power, time, and access. And the how do you deal with the challenges of being from South Asian descent and trying to navigate the activism and the politics which is required for success in new breakthroughs in protection for nature is some of these time-honored traditions that others have spoke about. I seek out all the time basically, support networks from other activists, in other racialized activists. They don't always have to be in environmentalism, and talk through what are the ways both to recognize how space is constrained, but also the opportunities to exercise power. So I'm at a different place in my career, and I feel a lot the obligation to think about the privilege I've had, the relationships and networks I've had, and how did I open that up for others to both share my experience and my lessons, but also ensure that new faces and new people are welcomed in, not in a way just that everything stays comfortable, but in a way that allows them to challenge what the agenda is of an organization, to challenge partnerships. Just a quick story at Nature Canada, and really kind of humbly starting from nothing. We are kind of embarking on a process to look really critically at both how does a commitment to Indigenous rights get reflected in partnerships, policies, and organizational practice, and how does a commitment to racial equality and to racial justice inform the way that we pursue the protection of nature. And it's not just about who's around on staff, because it's very much about the wider activist movement. And we have to think about the governance of the organizations, the partnership models, and how do we go and meet movements of young people, but also older people who are in spaces where they're organizing for nature in their own context. They don't have to do it necessarily in an NGO world. And so, I'm sort of excited and a little daunted at the opportunity and challenge to help the organization work on that. One never likes to feel like the person who should help. But what I found in the organization is there's a whole range of young people and older people who are excited to open up that conversation space and have some think through what needs to be transformed to bring that justice work into the mission of the organization. So there are a lot of challenges, but the opportunity to work with others and to work through that space and to think through what is both our privilege and our challenges is what's really important.
Great, thanks, Corey. And it's encouraging to hear that Nature Canada is working to bring in that racial justice lens and that Indigenous justice lens. It's encouraging for us as viewers to hear that. Paninda, I don't believe you have a chance to answer that question yet.
Yeah, I think so many of the sentiments that have been expressed already, I completely share those as well. But I'll briefly speak a little bit on this. I think keeping your authenticity as you navigate these generally white climate and environmental spaces has been challenging at the same time, but it makes you kind of really appreciate and understand how important allyship is, so that you can share those experiences and understand and process when you're being gaslighted. And so that's something that I've been kind of thinking about as well. And then broadly speaking, I think it's important to think about the lens and perspective that we as Canadian South Asians bring to the fight for environmental and climate justice, while at the same time, I think, Simran, you mentioned recognizing that we as South Asians are not a monolith. There's a wide variety of privileges and issues of social stratification, casteism, gender injustice, and all different types of oppression, anti-Black racism that we need to kind of contend with and challenge within our own communities. So we do bear that responsibility as well. And so I think we as Canadian South Asians, we can access our lived experiences and our shared history, which for many of us and our families does entail, sadly, oppression, violence, colonialism, and migration. And it really can allow us to access the issue of justice. And it's about kind of connecting those dots when we speak to folks within our communities, younger or older. And allowing us to connect those dots so that we can really build solidarity with other communities and like the Indigenous communities that have been fighting for sovereignty and climate justice for so long, and show up for them when we need to.
Great, thank you. Rahul, and then we'll have Vijay.
First off, wow. Amazing conversation, some really fantastic perspectives. I sadly don't have nearly the same to add along that dimension, so I'll just talk about it on a very personal level, which is, I think, being South Asian has its extraordinary advantages and also comes with some baggage, and that sort of makes it can make it complicated to be an active leader in this field. I think one of the first ones is sort of a cultural expectation about the pursuit of status and fields that are seen as being of higher status and fields that are being of lower status. And so I think the commitment to the pursuit of environmental justice, I don't know that it's necessarily more than other cultures, but it is definitely fraught with some baggage within the South Asian community. So I think there's one that's around whether the field is considered to be of social and cultural value by our elders, and just the community in general. I think the second, particularly for first generation, is the training about seeing one's path in terms of ROI or return on investment relative to the sacrifices that our parents made. There were economic sacrifices, social sacrifices, and more. And more often than not, at least more often than not in the scenarios that I'm most familiar with, it is going without resources, such that your children can have more resources. And it can be challenging to reconcile that their sacrifice enabled their children to further sacrifice for others. So it's just something that I've found that I've had to negotiate with. And then I think the third piece is one of representation. So I still remember being a kid and seeing Monica Deol on Much Music and being flabbergasted that, someone that was brown could even be on TV. And I think seeing representation like folks that are assembled on the Zoom call, I think demonstrates what's possible to not only the current generation, but the generations that will follow, but knowing that this is a viable path, that it's important work, and that there is a perspective to be shared and to be honored, I think is something that wasn't as available to me when I was growing up. And so I think those are the three components: the status, the responsibility to consider how to deliver like a return on investment on one's parents' sacrifices, and representation. Those are three challenges associated with, I think, being an environmental leader of South Asian descent.
Great, thanks, Rahul. And Vishal?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the panelists also kind of covered most of what I would have wanted to cover, but there is kind of a couple of things that does come to mind. One of which is when we consider what it means to be South Asian in Canada, a lot of times that identity is very blended, where you are this Indo-Canadian or this Pakistani Canadian or this something Canadian, and you're bounded to this hyphen where it feels as if you're oftentimes struggling between what does it mean to be South Asian in identity and what does it mean to be Canadian. And I think that particularly for a lot of young people, there's this internal struggle where you're trying to understand which parts of each identity do you feel best matches you. And I think that this isn't just necessarily for environmental justice, but I think this is for all fields and for all South Asians in Canada. One thing is that as we try to kind of navigate our own identity and navigate the spaces that we start to enter, one of the things that we start to encounter is obviously racism and colorism. And I think that it's something that oftentimes is very covert, particularly now as people are starting to become more tolerable and more sensitive to a lot of issues. It's not obviously not as overt and as bad as it used to be, but I do think that particularly young Canadians are trying to understand what does it mean to navigate certain spaces. What does it mean when someone says to you, hey, I would love to hear your people's perspective on this. And little tiny microaggressions or little tiny micro things that you think, okay, what exactly is happening underneath the layers here? And as activists, that's something that I think that a lot of us have probably had to deal with and had to face. And oftentimes there's this choice. Do I decide to say something or do I decide to keep my mouth shut? And it's difficult because you're trying to understand, do you personally want to kind of engage on this right now, or do you want to keep in mind a bigger picture or a bigger goal that you're working towards? And sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. But I think that that's kind of something as being a South Asian, trying to push for more children's rights protection and trying to push for just greater societal change in general, something that I've been cognizant of. The second thing is that in a lot of the work that I do, I've had the opportunity to be a youth speaker where I've spoken to more than 165,000 people across Canada. And as part of that, I've been trying to connect with people that are part of Gen Z, that are part of my generation, but also other generations. And I recognize that what does it mean to be an Indian teenager giving a speech? Or what does it mean to be an Indian teenager talking with kids and their families after we go to these events and go to these communities? And I think that growing up, and I'm happy that there was more representation on TV when I was growing up than Rahul and maybe some other people, but I still think that there wasn't enough. I remember my first show, How to Be Indian, being floored that there was an entire TV show around being an Indian family. And I share this because I think that for all of us, as we kind of continue to be out in our community and continue to be activists, it's important to understand how we ourselves are representation, and how we ourselves can use that privilege that we've been given to try and advocate for the interests of our own community and understand how impactful that truly is for a young person.
Great. Thanks, Vishal. So that kind of is connected to, I think we have time for one more question from myself, and then we'll turn to the audience. So in terms of the advice that you have for youth, so one of the goals of doing the South Asian Heritage Month campaign and these posters. So we've been doing them since 2016. The primary goal is to show youth that there are leaders from the South Asian communities in various different sectors and the successes that they've had, and you know, the work that they've done in their respective fields, and to give them a sense of to have them feel like these are their role models. These people can be role models for our youth in high school and younger. When they see people that look like them, it motivates them to learn more about those particular fields and to get involved, do advocacy. So what is your advice for youth to get involved in environmental justice? I've personally seen a lot more interest from especially high schoolers in the field of environmental justice. What would you advise them? Where should they look to be involved? Where should they look for mentorship? And how can they do more? So we'll start with Gori this time.
Yeah, I was going to say we should start in reverse order. I feel bad. Vishal seems to often go last. The advice to give youth who want to be involved. I want to say two things. I want to say if they're interested in getting involved in the sector of environmental organizations working for justice, they can absolutely keep that as the mission. Their perspectives matter. Their voices are badly needed and welcomed, and they should reach out to the organizations where they feel some openness to their perspective or someone that they know, and those of us inside the organizations are always happy to meet and be helpful. But I also agree, and I can't remember who else said it, maybe it was Maya, that to fight for the environment now is to fight for kind of a fair and decent life for everyone, and working in the environmental sector is not the only avenue to do that, and that the most important thing is to find the way in your, well, I wouldn't say most important, but it's equally as valid to find ways to mobilize in your own community. It can be in the context of the family and community organizations that you're part of. It can be politically through parties or through organizations like 15 in Fairness and others. There are many ways to find ways to fight for environmental justice, to struggle for environmental justice, and to learn a kind of a political orientation to how to navigate that aren't formally in the environmental sector. It can happen in the context of your faith organization, your temple or your gurdwara. And I think it's just such a, my main advice is to continue that passion. If you feel that passion in you and you want to find it, find the organization where you can practice it. And it doesn't have to be an environmental NGO, because these issues are so interconnected. You might be working for food access for people in inner cities. You might be working in the public sector, and you may face all kinds of different pressures from family and others to find that career path. But the environment is all around us, and it needs your voice. And you can find ways to serve it beyond environmental NGOs or the environmental sector formally. That said, I think the character of the sector is changing in some corners faster than others, and so there's an openness and a need for people to push in. So I don't want to discourage people either. It's just not the only option, and really it's the issue that connects so much now of what will mean a livable future for all. So I encourage people to find that passion and to find the organization that meets their needs, and to reach out to those that they know for advice on how best to find that home.
Great, thanks, Corey. And Vishal?
For sure. I think that particularly for a lot of youth, especially individuals in high school, what they're looking for is a purpose. There's this great quote that I have that I've read in the past, and it's life is the pursuit of what sets your soul on fire. And I think that for a lot of individuals, climate activists or environmental activism can be that purpose that really is fulfilling. But similarly to what Gori said as well, I think that doesn't necessarily have to be direct engagement in the sector. I think there's a lot of other opportunities to get involved, whether it is going the for-profit route and trying to work within CSR or social impact at a company like Walmart, or it's grassroots activism with community organizations, or even it's getting involved in your school and organizing shoreline cleanups, or working on climate advocacy within your school and trying to change your own school sustainability policies. I think the biggest advice that I can give is to start small. You don't have to reduce global temperature by 2 degrees this year. Do you know what I mean? You can definitely do something that's a little bit easier and a little bit tangible and just build up from there. When we started, when my brother and myself and 3 of our friends started Every Child Now back in 2012, I was in grade 6. And we started off with a bake sale, and that bake sale raised a little under $400. And for us, that was massive. And we were fundraising to try and support the building of a well in Sierra Leone. And since then, we've just grown through word of mouth and through interest and engagement from our community. So similarly, for young people that want to get involved in the sector, I would say just to start small and look at other alternative routes as well as direct routes, and not to close any doors at this time, but keep your options open and be excited, because this is a great place to be as well.
Great, thank you. And Dusha?
So I think Gary gave a great explanation of just thinking about how you can play that role in different ways. And I think it's really important to recognize that if we want to have progress on these issues, that means that we want to get a majority of people to share that value, that this is important, and we need to have agreement on that. And that means people of all different walks of life, all different types of sectors, see the importance of it and are working on that. So there's a responsibility individually for folks of engaging, as a South Asian, we heard this before, like within our own communities. So I think that is a great place to start in terms of setting up opportunities for mentoring and showing some guidance for youth. But the other thing is, I think there's opportunities to get political. We've heard a few different ways in the panel discussion today, but I think my experience, you're starting with a local government is a great way, actually, because you can see a lot of the direct impacts of that work in your community, and that could be a spark for you to get involved in other ways. And I think there's an ongoing sort of importance of being civically engaged and letting people know that their voice matters, right? So that's huge. And the other thing, I think a theme that just kept coming up today is unpacking your own privilege. I think to do this work and to really do it in an intersectional way, we need to continuously come to this work with a humble approach. And that's something that young people should be learning. And I think they're probably ahead of a lot of the older folks, right, on that. But it's very important to be critical and be unpacking what we bring to the table and always thinking about applying that intersectional lens. So I think these are the types of conversations that young people we should be engaging them in now, but also something that they can take responsibility and start having those conversations with their own families, with their own communities and friends. So those are kind of the key things I would focus on.
Great. Rahul?
3 things. Embrace your morality, invite your community, and connect to your passion. On the first one, embrace your morality. If you think something should be done to help, do it. Don't wait for an invitation. Everyone's invited. On the second one, invite your community. Helping feels amazing, and it can be a really social activity. So invite your friends and your community to join in, enjoy the good company, and make a difference together. And then on connecting to your passion, this is similar to what Gori and Vishal were mentioning, which is that it's extraordinary to be able to dedicate your life to environmental justice. And it starts, if that's not the path for you, that's fine. But it doesn't mean that you can't advocate for environmental solutions at every opportunity. When you connect your values with your skills, you can bring environmentalism into new arenas and find a way that you can uniquely deliver impact.
Great, thank you. Puninda?
Yeah, just building off of what's already been said, because solutions to the climate crisis need to be intersectional. I think every profession in the future will need to, transition and to a green economy and be green. We will need jobs that have a sustainability component to it. So, for example, to a young person, if you're interested in architecture, think about how you can advance the green building sector and, build low carbon, affordable housing. Young people these days, research shows Gen Y, Gen Z care whether the organizations they work for are environmentally sustainable. So they can exercise that power and that desire. And on the community level, I would also encourage young people to, organize in their communities instead of reinventing the wheel. Maybe seek out groups that may already be doing the work that you want to do. And the purpose of grassroots movement work is really to build that power in your community so that working class, poor, marginalized people can have that decision-making power at the community level. And doing that grassroots work, I find is grounding, rewarding, and really helps you understand and see that impact. So I guess a plug for Climate Justice Peel there. If you are in the Peel region and want to organize around climate justice, please consider checking us out, and we'd be happy to kind of grow that movement here.
Thanks, Belinda. Simran, and then Maya.
Thanks, Samia. Thanks for the shout out, Belinda. In terms of advice, I think I like to kind of reflect on why I'm doing this work and sort of what was the moment where I was like, yes, I'm in it. And I think back a lot to how I was kind of radicalized and raised in the 15 and Fairness and labor movement. And I remember 2-3 years ago, back when I was actually doing a fellowship on the labor market experiences of racialized women, especially South Asian women, I was at the 15 and Fairness provincial strategy meeting where we were hearing from an organizer, the director or the main organizer with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. And they organize mostly, obviously, South Asian and Black men immigrants. And her name is Bailout Desai. And I remember when she was talking about the moment when Trump was implementing the Muslim ban, and a lot of the taxi drivers at the time were engaging in direct action, work refusals, and just hearing her talk about how when workers and communities refuse to capitulate or bow down to capital or racist or white supremacists, when we all just withdraw our labor or stand in the way of whether it's a railway or a highway, we accomplish so much. That is the direct impact that we are never taught about in school. And when I was hearing her talk about how she worked with these workers to build that power and execute and practice and demonstrate that power, I'm not even lying. I was bawling my eyes out, and I went up to her and I was like, how did you know how to do this work? And I was like, she was like, you know it in your heart. It was really cheesy. But I just want to, really emphasize that this is the work that needs to be done. And for young people, know that we actually don't even have 10 years to stop the climate crisis. We have 5. That is not fear-mongering. We have 5 to stop irreversible climate change and transition to a 100% renewable energy economy while ensuring that the systems of capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy aren't reinforced in that process. And so, for all of us, whether you're in the panel or whether you're in the virtual room here, I think it's important we think about where we prioritize and direct our energies. So I would recommend for young people to join grassroots work, like Puninda said, to learn how to work in collectives where you have to make decisions democratically and in a participatory way, where you're centering relationship building and moving at the pace of trust. And even if your day job is working in the nonprofit sector and the environmental sector in a bank, maybe you're a student, maybe you're working for Jeff Bezos. in your free time, in whatever capacity you can, reach out and just have unapologetic politics, and link arms with the people in struggle with you. And be prepared for direct action. Be prepared to put your body on the line, and if you can't, find other ways to support. I would also say socially locate yourself. A lot of movement work is personal work. The amount of sort of personal, interpersonal reflection that I've done and relationship building is really key to this. And so a lot of that is unlearning the social conditioning that we've absorbed throughout our lifetimes. And we can do this both as individuals and as groups. And finally, I would actually say read. I know that sounds like, read a book, crack open a book. I don't mean that in a condescending way at all. I mean that for a lot of us, actually 99.9% of us, I'm actually a statistician, so I can say that. We go through high school and like our formal education without ever learning about what social change looks like, without ever reading what scholars like Frantz Fanon and Angela Davis and all these Black and Indigenous and people of color have written about how we actually dismantle systems of oppression. And so use this time under quarantine to do some political education, go into a reading group. I can absolutely give suggestions on reading groups that are happening right now where, we're reading lots of different things like, Leanne Simpson or Glenn Coulthard, and commit to that, commit to those politics. And I promise you, you won't be alone in that at all. And there are a lot of people in the struggle with you.
Thank you, Simran. And Maya?
Yeah, I mean, I think something I want to pull on also is that it is so scary to think that we only have 5 years, but we only have 5 years. And it's wild. When I was getting into climate work when I was in high school, we felt like we had so long, and that's just not the case. For decades in the halls of the UN climate summits, people have been chanting 1.5 to stay alive, 2.5 is genocide, and it is. And we're heading well towards 4 degrees of warming in the next couple years. So there is actually no more time, and now is the time to go big. It's really important, I think, also to really think about question and interrogate what we're being told about how you get involved in climate work, how you get involved in local work. For me, and I'm sure for many other folks in high school who might be able to identify with this, I was almost brainwashed into an organization that's now quite large called Free the Children, which I now understand to be a deep colonialist project about bringing English language to other places and actually really harming communities because it's not about self-determination. And I got totally swept up in that, and they preyed on high schoolers. That was the whole systematic project of the thing. And so if people are thinking about getting involved in your community, I think getting involved in your community is one of the most critically important things that you can do. And to remember that if you think you have a good idea, you're not unique. I think that's like a horrible, really scary Western, and it's a capitalist thing that you have special ideas and you can just do it on your own. You cannot. We are not islands. We cannot do things alone. And if you think you've had a good idea, someone else has had it first. And so really think about who has done this work already, who is doing it well. How can you tap into the work that communities have done before you? Honor that communities have been doing this for decades and decades, and instead think about ways that you can support those struggles on the ground. Mia Mingus says in Beyond Survival that in order for people to take risks, you have to have relationship. And that is why community organizing is so incredibly important. In order to be able to to feel safe, to feel empowered, and to feel the call that risks will take, we must forge strong relationships in order to get on railway tracks, in order to block the flow of capital, in order to go on strike, in order for workers to feel safe, to withhold their labor. We need to feel trust. And that's why getting involved in community organizations is the most critically important thing you can do. So something that you can do, I think, is join an organization. Join an organization that is transforming the material impacts of people's lives and their communities, and learn what's happening in the ground in a most meaningful way. And remember that, and it's been mentioned before, climate work is complicated, and climate work is everywhere. In many ways, we talk about the way that care work is climate work. What is care work? Teaching, healthcare, childcare, often already low carbon, often gendered work that if we pulled investments into, we could have huge investments in community with material impacts on people's lives immediately. And so if you're wondering about what to do right now, remember that these are absolutely extraordinary times. There are years where nothing happens, and there are weeks when years happen. And we're in this political moment where we have a bailout where just billions of dollars are just falling from the sky. Money we told we couldn't solve poverty. We can't get water to everybody. There's no way we could have everyone at a living wage. And now we know that is all garbage. We knew it then, but we definitely know it now. There is this very incredible political moment to absolutely change the world in which we live, and it will require risk, and it will require putting your body on the line, and it will require mass mobilization. So really remember that we have a very small window to enact massive political change in the midst of this pandemic, because we know what is coming next. And what we're all going to be told is, you know what, we ran out of money. And the first thing to go, and it's already coming down the pipe, is it's going to be cuts to education. There's going to be slashes to environmental protections. It is already happening. There's going to be a free for all for major corporations and for environmental destruction that is already happening in most parts of this country. There's going to be the gutting of social institutions and the protection of workers that is already happening. And we're going to have this national discussion about who is worthy of survival. And really, that's what we've been talking about the whole time. Who is worthy of surviving the climate crisis? And the answer has to be everyone. So if you're thinking about joining an organization, don't walk, run. If you're thinking about the community groups that you want to be involved with, look up the ones that are already operating in your communities and get involved now. And if you have questions, and I'm going to second here too, do research. Look up our movement leaders. Remember that now is the time to call for all of the changes you didn't think were possible in your wildest dreams, because we have less than 5 years on a very, very generous layout of how long there is. There's well under a decade. So do the research and call your community groups. And I'm sure a lot of people on this panel would be open to being reached out to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Maya. I feel like I shouldn't talk anymore, because that should just be the closing of the session. Really powerful and really eye-opening, and I'm sure our viewers think the same. But we do have a couple of questions for some of the panelists. So there's a comment that's been made about the programs that are offered for the protection of the environment, such as the recycling programs. There are certain barriers that exist that prevent people of color from participating. So whether it be linguistic barriers, accessibility to where they're living. So I would put this question to Dusha, as you brought that up with Toronto Environmental Alliance. What are some of the things that we can do as activists and advocates to break down some of these barriers that exist to have people of color participate more and to give them more access?
I think right now organizations, like if you're thinking of community-led organizations, they're doing a much better job. Where it becomes a lot more fraught with problems is some of these programs, policies, consultation processes that different governments or larger entities are running. And unfortunately, we see this time and time again. You know, you're going to have a community meeting to discuss a new plan or a strategy on something like climate change. It'll be on a weeknight at 6 o'clock. It's not taking into mind childcare. It's most often downtown Toronto, and I'm speaking from Toronto's context. But if you're someone who's working multiple jobs, if you're someone who needs childcare, if it's just challenging for you, what about mobility and accessibility issues? There's just so many things that we often don't work through. And I think this is also an opportunity where I think frontline community organizations are doing a much better job at actually engaging people where they're at and also speaking to them in like terms that they understand. And I think some of the work when I was at the Toronto Environmental Alliance that we did was actually working with community organizations that were already connected to the grassroots community, and it could be based on language, it could be based on their religious faith. But I think these are the areas where we need to be having these conversations, and those conversations should be driving policy change. So if you're talking about a recycling program, why are we having a consultation at, you know, a civic center instead of going to buildings, let's say, if you're trying to tackle high-rise buildings, why aren't you doing pop-ups in those buildings, hiring people who could be animators who speak different languages based on the needs of that community? There's really a lot of solutions at our fingertips. It's that we're not investing in those right solutions. So I really do think we have to change the way we have these conversations to really think meaningfully about how we take those conversations to where people are already at.
Great, thank you. So the next question is on the intersection of gender and being South Asian and how that impacts, or does it impact, your fight towards environmental justice? And that question is for Simran.
Sorry, my internet just kind of cut out. Could you repeat that question?
Sure, it's on the how does the intersection of gender and being South Asian have an effect on doing the work that you're doing in environmental justice? Does it have an impact, and to what extent?
I mean, if I'm looking at it as an organizer, as a South Asian, both a queer and female organizer in Peel, it is obviously very hard because, you know, especially in the South Asian community, there's a reverence towards male cis het leadership. And I know from folks who've organized in the Punjabi community before, you know, it's really hard to go up against the uncles or against the people who wield a lot of power in institutions, whether they be faith institutions or, you know, city council or otherwise. And so I think there are definitely dynamics around that. And it's important that we put women and queer and trans folks, as well as, you know, allying and uplifting Black leadership in our spaces. I think that's really important. And broadly, I know a lot has been written about climate justice disproportionately impacting women. And I really love what Maya mentioned about care work, right? The solution to the climate crisis is by recognizing that there are trillions and trillions of dollars across the world that are absorbed by capitalists through the unpaid and informal labor of women, of feminized labor, care work. And so a huge part of our climate work is doing solidarity work, solidarity building and organizing with teachers, with the PSWs and the nurses that are predominantly racialized and migrants in the long-term care sector right now who are struggling. And so climate justice and environmental justice for me is absolutely tied to gender injustice and also gendered violence. You know, right now, we're seeing that people who are confined to their homes, abusers, people who perpetuate violence in the home are exacerbating that. That is an issue that already exists, but we need to have structures in place in our communities that address that and ensure that women and non-binary folks have a voice in our movements.
Thank you, Simran. There's a question for Rahul. So majority of the panelists today have either been doing grassroots work or have been doing advocacy with not-for-profits. You have done environmental justice work in the for-profit world. How is that different? What is your experience like in trying to you manage the struggle between making profit and also trying to take care of the environment? Is that a struggle, or is that naturally something that came for you?
Less of a struggle because I went to business school, and so I learned the native language essentially, and tried to figure out how to be an ally from within. While many others were, so essentially I was burrowing from the inside out and trying to meet people that were burrowing from the outside in. I think, I don't know this factually, but given past nonprofit work, you know, everyone needs an ally. And oftentimes there's a lot of advocacy work done from the outside to get corporations to contemplate other ways, consider other ways of making money, other ways of engaging with their staff, the community. And while there's a defined and important role for sort of protest, there's also an important role for guiding organizations to alternative solutions. And so I've just found that my role was to be an open listener and an advocate inside, to partner with other individuals that knew more and had strong values, and tried to help them figure out how to navigate the system to shift the way that organizations function.
Great, thank you. And Maya, so you mentioned about the urgency of the situation, and that we have 5 years or less to make change, and to ensure that we have policies in place that will have a positive impact. And how do you convey that message to people that are not necessarily on board? So within the South Asian community, how do you convey that in an effective way? And what tools can we use to convey that message?
Well, relationship building is a big key to this. Having the relationships where you can have honest conversations with people in your community is so important. You never want to devolve to a place like my dad and I are in right now, where he likes to say he wants to like move south, and I go, I didn't know you like to live under the water. There's like a complicated story that I think has to be told about what type of world is coming, and have, healthy stories that we tell about it. I think that talking about connecting communities with communities that are on the front line, connecting our communities with communities that are experiencing the impacts of environmental destruction in their communities is a very, very important and critical way that we can go about that. So for example, Indigenous solidarity is a very important thing to talk about in our communities, because this colonial project can feel very far away, and we can feel in a lot of ways that, well, we've been impacted by colonialism and imperialism. For a lot of people, that's the reason they immigrated or migrated for their lives or for a better life in the first place. And then we don't realize, of course, that we are then participating further in a colonial project that perpetuates more environmental destruction and a lot of damage. So telling those stories and teaching people in those ways, taking folks to things like blockades. I mean, for me, I kind of got my first big eye-opening when I was at the UN climate talks in 2016. And it was the eve before the event was supposed to happen. And I was talking with a bunch of my family members, and I was sitting with a whole bunch of other South Asians, all kind of Zoom calling our families and Skyping our families and talking about what was going to happen the next day. And then 4 hours later, Donald Trump was elected in the United States, and the entire US negotiation team just left, just took off and got on planes, and the whole environmental project of the Paris Agreement just started to crumble over 3 days. And now it means absolutely nothing. You can pinky swear that you're going to participate in climate action, but that's non-binding multilateral agreements get us nowhere. It's actually direct action. So a lot of people decided at the climate talks, for example, they got straight on planes from Marrakesh, Morocco, and went directly to Standing Rock, where the Army Corps of Engineers were expected any day now. And that type of ownership in action, and seeing that, it is direct action that is going to help address this climate crisis, was a really big breakthrough for my family, where we first had those conversations about, if most of the world goes underwater, what does it mean to go home? And where is home then? And what does it mean to be in solidarity here? When we understand that, one of the reasons for me and the difficult stories I had with my family and my community afterwards was, if climate change hits as hard as we know it is going to, then the biggest crisis, one of the biggest crises we're going to face is migration. What do borders mean when over half the world will have to move north and will be moving north? It is only a matter of time. So trying to figure out creative and engaging ways that we're not talking down but talking to, bringing people into analysis that meets them where they're at and recognizes the history of where we came from, not in a way that shames, but in a way that educates. And if people feel angry about that later, that's on them to work through. All we have to do is keep providing the stories, keep providing the facts, bringing people into relationship so that you're talking to friends, you're not talking to strangers. That's something that has felt very empowering and helpful.
Great, thank you so much. So we don't have any more questions from the audience. Does anybody want to give any closing thoughts before we sign out for the evening? No. All right. I guess it's late. People have, you know, obviously their families and other things to get to. So
I think we probably just want to thank you so much for bringing us together. It has been an incredibly rich panel. I hope that the viewers enjoyed. But it was your initiative that helped to bring people from different organizations and different cities to reflect on the moment that we're in for environmental activism, and what it means to come from the different communities that we are part of, and how we carry that forward as part of the work. And I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting all the others on the panel. And thanks so much to the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians for having convened us.
Thank you so much, Gauri, for that. And I'm sure that this is not the end of our partnership. As CASA wants to do more and wants to get involved more and wants to do some public awareness on this issue and see how we can be a greater leader in environmental justice. I'm sure we're going to cross paths again in the future. I want to thank everyone that joined us on the panel. I want to thank all our viewers here on Zoom and on Facebook for tuning in. So the session obviously will be available on our Facebook. We'll also upload it on YouTube for those individuals that don't have access to Facebook. And so stay tuned. CASA is online every week. As you know, we have our anti-hate series on Facebook, and we'll be talking about something that we discussed a little bit here as well, and we'll be discussing white supremacy and the rise of the white right-wing movement all across the country and across the world too, actually. So tune in for that on Tuesday next week. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye now.